again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for another episode of Fuel the Pedal podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether if you're listening directly on Fuel the Pedal website player, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast app available out there. We are at episode number 11, and what a great episode this is. We go back to the other side of the pond to get to Canada at University of Toronto, where our next guest comes from. These past weeks have been quite busy with the trip to Brussels to attend the Science and Cycling Conference, along with a lot of research from our lab and fortunately some recent publications from our research group that came out as well. The first one being our infographic finally published on the British Journal of Sports Medicine entitled The Road to the Ergogenic Effect of Caffeine on Exercise Performance, where we've tried to summarize and simplify some of the evidence up until now. Quite recently, another publication on nutrients entitled More Research is Needed to Establish the Ergogenic Effect of Caffeine in Female Athletes. The title is pretty self-explanatory. And another article accepted now in press in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition on the prevalence and patterns of dietary supplement use in elite Spanish athletes. And hopefully if you're hearing this in the near future, it will already be available. And as usual, before getting into today's topic, please enjoy a quick snapshot of the latest news in cycling. The Tour de France has started, 10 stages have now gone through. If you're hearing this in the future, you probably know a lot more than I do right now, but please, dear listener from the future, do not tell me who has won. For now, Julien Alaphilippe from Team de Koenig Quickstep remains in the yellow jersey, Peter Sagan from Bora Hansgrohe leads the points jersey, and Tim Wellens from Lotto Soudal is leading the polka dot jersey for the best climber. But this is just the beginning, as the main mountain finishes are still yet to come and are usually decisive for the general classification. On stage 14, for example, the riders will have a top mountain finish on top of the legendary Col de Tourmalet, but also on stage 15, 19 and on stage 20, the penultimate day at Val Thorens, riders will have a really tough mountaintop finish. Looking forward to see what happens in the following weeks and if I win the bet I made with some friends. Let's hope I get to have dinner for free. But the Tour is not the only competition right now. The Giro Rosa from the UCI Women's World Tour calendar has been undergoing as well, and Annemiek van Vleuten of the Netherlands successfully defended her Giro Rosa title with a comfortable win after the race's final stage in Undine, Italy. Going into Sunday's finale with the lead of almost 4 minutes, the 36-year-old could afford to finish 70 seconds back in 21st place in the last stage. Marianne Vos, the last rider to retain the title in 2012, won the final stage, her 4th win of the week. Vos, who has won the title 3 times, finished 20th overall. In addition to the overall race win, Van Vleuten will also take home the purple and green jerseys as winner of the points and mountain classifications. So, on to the good stuff now. Today we are going to complement the episode number 8 with Dr. Stuart Phillips and Dr. Philippe Teixeira, and we will dig deeper into protein metabolism of endurance athletes, particularly cyclists, with Dr. Daniel Moore from the University of Toronto. Daniel Moore is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education and a member of the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology and the American Society for Nutrition. His research explores the interplay between exercise and nutrition and how the two can be used to optimize the quantity and quality of muscle across a range of different populations, including children, athletes, and older adults. He has authored over 75 peer-reviewed papers and was the recipient of a Canada Foundation for the Innovation to build a high-performance muscle metabolism research lab at the University of Toronto. His excellence in research was recognized by the American Society for Nutrition as the 2012 recipient for the Peter Reed's Young Investigator Award. I've been following Dr. Moore's research for a while now, and I must say that in a world where research interests in protein metabolism are excessively focused on muscle hypertrophy, Dr. Moore is one of the few with a specific focus on protein metabolism and protein requirements in endurance athletes and has been contributing a lot to improve the knowledge in this area, with some of his recent work focusing on how elevated can protein requirements become in situations of training with low carbohydrate availability, which is one of the topics we will try to explore on this episode. So, How is muscle protein metabolism in endurance exercise any different from resistance-based exercise? How much protein should a cyclist ingest in long training sessions or racing? How does protein ingestion affect training adaptations? Is it important to include protein at breakfast? Is protein worth considering in the 4-hour recovery period? How can protein supplementation be of any help here? All this and much more up next on episode 11 of Fuel the Pedal podcast. Hi Daniel, it's so good to have you here with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Gabriel.
Daniel, it's an honor to finally have you here on Fuel the Pedal podcast. As someone who is focusing and contributing so much to the research on protein metabolism for endurance athletes, it was almost mandatory to have you on, and I surely appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you very much.
So, Daniel, before we start, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your trajectory so far, and your research?
Yes, so I started my research at McMaster University under the tutelage of Dr. Stuart Phillips, who is a giant in the field, and so I was very fortunate to be able to train under the best, I believe. My graduate research was understanding how exercise and nutrition, primarily dietary protein, affects the way in which skeletal muscle remodels and rebuilds itself, especially after resistance exercise. So we use stable isotope tracers to actually measure direct rates of muscle protein synthesis of different proteins within the muscle, the contractile, myofibrillar, and connective collagen tissue, for example. After my graduate work, I actually spent 3 years in industry working at the Nestlé Research Center in Lausanne, Switzerland. One of the big businesses we worked with there was PowerBar, which has since been sold, I believe, to Post. And then I realized that I had a lot of questions that I was interested in answering that maybe Nestlé wasn't so much so, and came back to Canada and was fortunate enough to land a position at University of Toronto, where I've been since 2013, and my research has continued on the same track, looking at protein metabolism across the lifespan, so children, adolescents, right up to the oldest old. But I felt that there was underrepresented research on endurance athletes. A lot of the times, I think the perception is that protein is for building bigger muscles, and I don't think that's always the case, and hopefully in our discussions today, some of that will be threshed out. So still using the stable isotopes and understanding what happens at the whole body as well as the skeletal muscle level.
Perfect. That's the perception that I have as well, that it's a huge discrepancy on the research on both resistance and endurance athletes. And I must say that I've been following your research for a while, especially when one has a keen interest in endurance exercise, and all we see around us is research on protein metabolism, focusing systematically on hypertrophy, on muscle protein synthesis for resistance athletes, all that never-ending obsession with the gains. And your name really stuck into my mind as one of the researchers actually focusing on protein metabolism for endurance athletes. So, Daniel, regarding this last comment that you just did, why do you think the research is so uneven on the published research regarding protein metabolism in resistance versus endurance athletes?
Yeah, well, certainly, I think one of the fundamental issues is that in order to build tissue, which is a goal of many resistance-trained athletes through hypertrophy, gaining lean mass, we have to provide the building blocks to support that growth. And it will only come through the amino acids in our diet and the protein that we eat. So the perception that building bigger muscles requires high amounts of protein is pervasive, but there is some rationale to that, to the need for protein to build muscle. That's also linked to some of the early work understanding protein metabolism in the skeletal muscle came from some of the work using resistance exercise as a modality, and showing that certainly if we do resistance exercise, our muscles more sensitive to the dietary protein that we eat, and that is ultimately a fundamental reason why we can grow our muscle with resistance exercise. But endurance exercises can be quite stressful on the muscle as well. Not only that, but we see that protein metabolism differences between resistance and endurance athletes are fairly different in my perspective. Whereas resistance exercise it's a very muscle-centric stimulus. endurance exercise is a whole body stimulus. So although we're also using our muscles to move us through the race, whether it be cycling or running, there is a contribution of protein and amino acids as a source of fuel. And so we can have situations where if we've used amino acids as fuel, they're not available to help us recover during the post-exercise period. So we have to eat protein to replenish these. Such exercises as running can also cause stress on the bones and the muscles through the weight-bearing forces. Mm-hmm. And there's also some suggestion that some of the ischemia that we see during exercise to tissues like the splanchnic region, the intestine, for example, as the blood's diverted to the working muscle and away from the intestine, can perhaps cause some small amounts of damage that ultimately had to be repaired in the post-exercise period. So whereas muscle resistance exercise is, I feel, very muscle-centric stimulus, endurance exercise is a whole body stimulus. And so we need to provide protein to help our body recover from that stress and also replace perhaps some of the fuel, the protein that we use as a fuel during our exercise.
That's really, really interesting and a really good way to start providing some context. So I believe that it is very well established that dietary protein plays an important role in both training, adaptation, and recovery. And these may be fundamental roles of protein in the endurance athlete's diet. So while there is still debate in what the optimal protein ingestion should be for athletes, the available recommendations are largely based on research examining nitrogen balance, which according to recent work from your lab may underestimate true requirements. So based on this, would you say that is there a need to reevaluate the current protein recommendations for endurance athletes? Where does the current science stand here?
Yeah, I think with anything in science, it's the sum of the evidence that really directs the recommendations and not any individual study. So I still believe that there's a need to pursue additional research and avenues of questions, because the way I see protein requirements is it's not necessarily a catch-all. I think we've come to the point where we've established that athletes, whether resistance or endurance, have greater protein needs than the non-exercising general population. And the historical perspective of the protein requirements were to reduce the disease risk reduction. So basically, what is the minimum intake we need so that we can be healthy? Athletes want to have health, but they want to be able to perform at a high level. So what is the minimum requirement for the general population is clearly not the optimal intake in my perspective for the athlete. Sure. Now, when we talk about the requirement, there's a lot of nuance to what a requirement should be. So it depends on a lot of factors. The type of training you're doing, what volume of training you're doing it in, whether or not you're fueling during your training with carbohydrates, for example, or not. All these factor into what is the requirement in that instance. But in general, what we think is that an intake that's at least 1.6, maybe 1.8 grams per kilogram seems to be able to satisfy the protein requirements of an athlete who's putting in about maybe an hour or two of training a day. As someone who's doing twice a day or much longer, I think that scales with the energy expenditure. So the biggest factor, I think, to meeting protein needs is also, for the endurance athlete anyways, is meeting your energy needs. Certainly if you're not consuming adequate energy, your needs for protein go up. It's because we start using that as a source of fuel. But if we have high energy expenditures but are matched by an energy intake, then we should be able to cover our protein needs with about 10% energy coming from protein. An example actually could be the Tour de France. During the very heavy stages of that race and the high energy intakes that these athletes need, they actually self-select protein intake at about 2.5 to 3 grams per kilogram per day. And that's basically because they're eating such a high amount of energy. So it's not that they have to be focused on protein or protein supplements. Well, the supplements might be a convenient way to meet energy and protein needs. Focusing on a whole food diet and matching the energy you expend during training is the simplest way, I think, to meeting your daily requirements.
Yeah, definitely. The Tour de France is a great example of a situation in which, by simply matching the energy intake to the energy expenditure from one stage, will inevitably make the cyclists meet their macronutrient recommendations. Particularly in the case of protein, I see from the data we have available from older studies during the previous editions of the Tour, cyclists easily reached 3 grams per kilo, even in a more recent one performed during the Vuelta a España from Muros, I believe it's the first author, they even surpassed the 3 grams per day average. And this has always filled me with curiosity, because the ACSM recommendations for protein intake in endurance athletes clearly establish a range from 1.2 to 2 grams per kilo, which is a very wide range considering its lower and upper limits. And then we had data from Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky's lab pointing out that top endurance athletes should try and reach 1.6 grams per kilo per day, which almost athletes already meet in my experience. And on top of this, further work from your lab then suggested that protein requirements for endurance athletes might eventually reach 1.8 grams per kilo per day. So from what I see here, Daniel, help me out here. Research seems to be progressively leaning towards the upper end of the original ACSM protein requirements. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more here about the sort of chronological evolution on optimal protein requirements for endurance athletes, and where are we standing right now?
Yes, great. Yeah, so some of the historical perspective to the requirement research that had been done, certainly by Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky, which you identify there, some of the seminal work, was really focusing on what is the intake that maintains nitrogen balance. So knowing how much protein is taken in, nitrogen is a component of amino acids specific to protein, and then being able to measure all the routes of nitrogen loss through sweat, urine, feces, skin, miscellaneous losses. We can get an intake that matches output. Now, that research doesn't really inform us on what intake would optimize performance. And so some of the research that we've done using stable isotope tracers, we've been able to dial a little bit closer on what we think might be a benefit to a higher protein to maintain protein metabolism. And so the protein in our body is very dynamic. It's constantly being broken down into its constituent amino acids. And those amino acids can be used as a source of fuel or resynthesized into body proteins, whether it be in the muscle, the bone, the liver, essentially any tissue in our body. And so we can measure this process of turnover, the breakdown and synthesis, through stable isotopes. And so whereas nitrogen balance is a bit of a black box, we can measure what goes in and what comes out, we lose sense of what's happening with that metabolism once that nitrogen is in the body. So using the indicator amino acid oxidation technique, which is just a fancy word for an oral, non-invasive stable isotope, we were able to have endurance athletes come to the lab 5 or 6 times. They performed a standardized bout of exercise. In this case, it was a 20-kilometer run. And then we were able to feed them the stable isotope. So this is an amino acid that's slightly heavier than those normally found in your body. So we can track where it goes. And so, for example, if it's a carbon label and we use that amino acid as a source of fuel, it actually comes out in our breath. The carbon dioxide that we breathe out is a little bit heavier than what's normally found. And so through some fancy equations, we can model how much protein the body is using to build a body protein. So during the recovery period, how much protein is able to optimize or enhance whole body protein synthesis, which we think is an important metric for helping athletes recover.
That's great.
So in this research, we found that an average intake of about 1.6 was optimal to help these athletes' bodies repair tissue. And so with a safe intake at a 95% confidence interval, we suggest that closer to 1.8 grams per kilogram per day was sufficient to meet the needs of 95% of the population to maximize whole body protein synthesis during recovery. So this is maybe perhaps a step up from the nitrogen balance because it's not just measuring a black box, it's actually measuring metabolism of the protein in our body, but it still doesn't link to what an athlete is really interested in, that's performance. And so we took this research one step further and actually simulated an endurance athlete's higher intensity 4-day training block where over 4 days they completed 55 kilometers running. So it was 20 kilometers one day, 10, 5, and then 20 kilometers on the second day, or the fourth day, excuse me. And we controlled the diet at 3 different levels. One was the current RDA of 0.93 based on indicator amino acid oxidation. And so this was our negative control. We thought that metabolism would be lowest on this intake and that performance over that 4-day period would decrease. And so we measured performance looking at a 5-kilometer time trial run as well as muscle strength. We tested 1.2 grams per kilogram, which as you allude to is the lower end of the ACSM recommendations, which
Yes.
are broad because, as I mentioned, the requirements for athletes can be specific to what they're doing. So a broad range is kind of a catch-all, I think. So we tested the 1.2, which was also the lower intake of what we saw was sufficient in our indicator amino acid oxidation trial. And then we tested them at a 1.8, which was what we determined would be sufficient to maximize the recovery from the exercise. And so over the 4 days of training, we showed that metabolism or protein balance was lowest on the low intake, was neutral at the moderate intake, and was positive at the high intake. So we thought that is indication that the 1.2, which was suggested to be required for nitrogen balance, was indeed sufficient. They maintained nitrogen balance. But what we saw was that at 1.2 grams per kilogram per day or lower, athletes all got weaker and their time trials got slower in just 4 days of training. And so on the higher intake, they not only got stronger, but they also got faster over that 4 day period. And the differences weren't large. It was only about 16 seconds, but on a 5 kilometer time trial, that can be quite substantial, about 1 to 2% change. And so we took this as an indication that if we optimize protein remodeling during recovery, which our acute indicator amino acid oxidation trial did, and move it out into more of a real-world setting where we control the diet and training, that individuals who are consuming at the higher end of these intakes are actually better able to maintain or perhaps even improve their performance over this intensified training period. So we think that now that suggests that athletes should be at that higher end of intake. But as you alluded to earlier, if they're eating their adequate energy, that really is only about 10% energy by protein. So it shouldn't be difficult to obtain, but those that don't obtain it could be sacrificing their training goals.
Yes, and you performed this research on runners, right?
Correct.
Do you think this could be applied in the same way to cyclists as well?
I do think so, to a certain extent. So we certainly know that whether you run or you cycle, the contribution of protein to energy is about the same. So if that protein requirement is there to help replenish what you lose during exercise, then certainly cyclists would need that higher intake as well. We chose running as our modality for a couple reasons. One, it's something that there's a lot of cycling out there, but there's a lot of runners as well. And I'm not sure what the numbers boil down to, but I would imagine there's just as many, if not perhaps a few more runners than cyclists. So it was a bit of a wider population. But it is also a little bit more weight-bearing. And so the stress associated with running, certainly if you're running downhill, for example, can lead to damage. And so I think perhaps the requirement in runners might be a little bit higher than cyclists. But certainly we know that cycling can be an extremely stressful event and very high energy expenditures. So I don't imagine the requirements would be substantially different between the two modalities. And I would believe that the higher intake would also maintain training quality in cyclists as well.
Yeah, sure. Especially considering that both training and competition in cycling are usually longer than in running competitions.
Great point. Yeah.
And would you believe that in female endurance athletes, the same recommendations would apply as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, something that we're following up on as we speak. I have a student who is using that for a thesis work to understand how some of the requirements in females versus males. Certainly, we know that estrogen has a protein sparing effect. And so we're better able to utilize fat when we have estrogen that's high. And it's been shown by Dr. Tarnopolsky as well, by giving estrogen to males, they actually reduce amino acid oxidation and increase fat oxidation. So in so much as the requirement is based on this oxidation, perhaps during certain phases of the menstrual cycle, such as the follicular, where the ratio of estrogen to progesterone is quite high, the requirement might actually be a little bit lower in females. Whereas in the luteal phase, where that ratio is reversed, progesterone is higher, we actually see metabolism becoming much more male-like, for lack of a better term. And so we're going to follow up on that. I believe that the requirement will still be elevated in female athletes, but perhaps during the follicular phase, it actually might be lowered somewhat. But that's something that hopefully if we can chat again in another year, I can fill you in on. But I do believe that the requirements are still going to be elevated in this population. And it's unfortunate we're at this stage in the research where we still don't have these fundamental questions answered. And it just speaks to the unfortunate underrepresentation of females in sports science research. And so our lab's trying to help correct that by focusing a little bit more on potential sex-based differences.
hopefully in 1 year or less, we can catch up again and get the updates on that. So this is fascinating stuff. I could be talking about this whole day. Because, every time we talk about protein is always the same. It's always the same. See, how can we increase body mass? How can we increase fat-free mass? And there is a need for protein in these athletes and things that need to be taken into account. And one of them may actually be the increased amino acid oxidation that may happen through endurance exercise. And we've briefly touched on this topic before on the podcast with Dr. Philippe Teixeira and Stuart Phillips, where we've talked about leucine being probably the one and probably the only major contributor to amino acid oxidation. So could you perhaps get into more detail on this? Is this leucine oxidation significant over time in terms of quantities, let's say over a course of 3-hour training or a 6-hour race eventually? Does this amino acid oxidation change in trained versus untrained athletes or in male versus female? What do we know about this?
Yeah, it's a great point. So certainly leucine being a branched chain amino acid as well as isoleucine and valine, it's one of the amino acids that's preferentially metabolized or used as a source of fuel within the skeletal muscle. So leucine is certainly, as far as research shows, is the one that is used as primarily as a source of fuel during exercise. Some of the other branched chains could also be contributors to energy expenditure because they share a common enzyme, but leucine is certainly the highest one. What we know is that if you're trained, two things happen. One, you reduce your reliance on amino acids as a source of fuel. So at the same exercise intensity, because we're better able to use fat as a fuel, it actually minimizes a leucine oxidation. But we also have adaptations that allow us a greater capacity to measure or to oxidize leucine primarily. So while we may use it at a lower percentage at the same intensity, if our intensity is increased, then we have a greater capacity to use that as a source of fuel. And so we've done some research in trained athletes where over the course of a 1-hour run at about 70 or 75% of the VO2 max, these athletes can burn through the equivalent of about 10 grams of protein based on the leucine oxidation alone. And so if you think about a protein as being built by all 20 amino acids, if we suddenly have one amino acid that is limiting, then we can't build that protein. And so even if leucine is the primary or perhaps only amino acid that's used as a source of fuel, during recovery, if we don't have sufficient amounts of that leucine, then we can't build the rest of the proteins in our body. Sure. And so in an hour at about 70% of your VO2 in running, and I don't think this is much different in cycling as well, we can burn through the leucine equivalent of about 10 grams of protein. And so when you're trying to scale that up, I think every hour you could roughly estimate about the same level of oxidation, except that we see that when carbohydrate becomes limiting, especially within the muscle, such as when we have low muscle glycogen, the leucine oxidation can go from about 2 to 5%, right up to 10% energy coming from amino acid oxidation or protein oxidation. So if you're going out for a 3-hour ride, for example, and you're not fueling during that ride, then you can expect that the 10 grams of protein you might burn in the first hour could increase in the second and third hour when we start to have limited carbohydrate stores. So certainly how you train can influence your requirements, but certainly someone who's out for a 6-hour ride or a 6-hour race should definitely be conscious of the fact that they're going to need to consume protein, if not throughout, definitely after, to help replenish or replace what was used as a source of fuel during that training.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. That's great, Daniel. We've touched precisely on this point in the episode with Stuart Phillips and Philippe Teixeira as well, in which we talked about the less feeding occasions cyclists normally have, and especially considering the long training sessions or racing scenarios. And we can actually assume a scenario like that right now. Let's assume, for instance, that a cyclist has a long 5-hour training session with some tough climbing or a race with similar duration. He has its breakfast with around 20 grams of protein. He then jumps on the bike for said session or race. He fuels correctly with carbs using energy drinks, gels, bars that provide almost no protein at all. Unless you give them, of course, protein bars, but that won't be probably the most gut-friendly option. He then finishes the race. He starts his recovery protocol, taking advantage of the 4-hour recovery window to provide hourly the right amount of carbs along with some protein as well. Then he later has dinner, and by the end of that day, he ingested a total of 2 to 2.5 grams per kilo, not evenly distributed, of course, with a gap of 5 hours in between. And in this scenario, based on the possible significant leucine and amino acid oxidation that you just referred to, and assuming the total daily protein requirements were met, my million-dollar question here would be, does this athlete benefit from BCAAs or another form of amino acid provision during this period?
That's a great question. So on balance, I would say that if they're able to meet their protein requirements on a daily basis, that's probably one of the most important factors to consider. What we do see, though, is that it's how you eat the protein throughout the day can influence how it's metabolized. And so if we overconsume protein at any single meal, our body has a finite capacity to assimilate that protein into body, muscle tissue, for example. And so any amino acids consumed in excess of this capacity are used as a source of fuel. So spreading that protein out throughout the day, it might be more metabolically efficient. If the training interferes with the ability to spread that out, and they're now scrambling to meet their protein needs, for example, at the end of the day through big meals, then there's some suggestion that perhaps consuming some branched chain amino acids, for example, during exercise, just at a small amount, your body will use those as a source of fuel before it uses its endogenous stores. So perhaps you might be in a better position after exercise to recover when you eat that protein meal to help with muscle glycogen resynthesis or just to satisfy your energy demand. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There's some theoretical justification for perhaps consuming some small amounts of BCAAs during training, but I think the most important point from my perspective is to try and meet those protein needs through whole foods. There's a lot of nutrient-rich foods that we can eat that would arguably have a leg up on supplements that we're just starting to understand a little bit more about all the non-protein factors that can help our body utilize amino acids from our diet that are different than if they're given in the free form, such as crystalline amino acids.
Really, really good point to highlight, Daniel, focusing on mainly meeting the protein requirements throughout the day rather than excessively focus on tiny details during training sessions that probably will have a very small effect, and let's hope our listeners got this message right. And regarding the role of protein in the pre-exercise period, so in the early ages of cycling, we saw that breakfast before the races was always the same, pasta. Mm-hmm. And now the pro peloton seems to have surrendered to the oats plus eggs breakfast. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be an improved concern on providing protein to the riders before the race. So my question here would be, is there some advantage in providing protein in cyclists' breakfast? Could this possibly contribute to improved recovery after the race, considering that riders are not consuming protein during the race?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I would flip it around and say if it's a one-off race where you're going to have more than, say, 48 hours to recover before your next training or race,
sure.
Then the pre-event meal should really be designed to top up your carbohydrate stores and minimize any GI distress you might have during the race. I think those are the most important factors. Now, if you're talking about a multi-day race or someone who's training multiple days, there is an advantage, I believe, to consuming some protein before the event with breakfast for the reason we just indicated, that it's going to help the body might use those amino acids as fuel before it starts to break down body proteins, and it might put you in a better position to recover after the race. I think what we have to be mindful of, though, is that protein has a high thermic effect, and that's because it basically it takes energy for our body to break it down. And so the athlete wants to make sure they're not consuming a large amount of protein within about an hour or two before the event, because that can also cause GI distress. So there could be some tinkering in there as far as how much protein is in the breakfast or how early before the race that it's consumed. But certainly you don't want to be 30 minutes into a race and start to get some GI distress, which eating too much protein or protein that is fatty, eggs and bacon, we love our bacon here in Canada, too much of that before a race is probably not going to put you in a good position.
I think you've raised two fantastic points there, and one of them being, the difference from needing to recover from a one-day race versus a multi-stage race in which a cyclist would benefit more from adding protein to the high-carb breakfast. Mm-hmm. And the second point being related to having protein during exercise or even before, and we've discussed this in a previous podcast episode with Dr. Jamie Pugh, in which he mentioned that protein needs time to digest, and therefore it may actually increase the risk of having gastrointestinal symptoms during the race, which may not be always taken into account by many athletes competing. What worries me in cycling is that we go from a trend to another trend. Okay, I believe it's good that now we are considering oats and eggs, but what I see is a pattern in which everyone ate pasta. For now, everyone is eating oats and eggs. Absolutely everyone is eating oats and eggs. I don't see individualization. I don't see, for example, why can't you eat bread, toasts with honey? There would be maple syrup, I imagine, or some sort of jelly, or even with ham. There are actually a lot of possible choices here. When I see cyclists in a team from varied cultures, I would expect, this would be my idea, to find that breakfast is really personal. It would vary a lot, but what I see is that it's always the same for everyone. Would you agree that this aspect should also be taken into consideration here?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, we can look at the recommendations for maybe target intakes, but one of the most important thing I think for an athlete is to find out what works for them. And the way you do this is to basically tinker in your training. If you're going out for a hard training ride that would simulate a race, that's the time to experiment with a different type of breakfast, because if you're going to find out what works, it's great to find out in training, and if you're going to find out what doesn't work, you really want to make sure that's in training and not in the race. But just tinker, find out what works for you.
Yes. Could we perhaps settle protein recommendations for pre-endurance events?
I would think so. For protein before an event, there's really no benefit to consuming more than about a 1/4 gram per kilogram within any given meal, because that seems to be what our body can handle in any given meal. Above that, you're going to use it as a source of fuel, or it's going to hang around in the stomach a little bit too long before the event. So I think a meal protein intake that meets or definitely doesn't exceed 0.2 grams per kilogram, I think is where an athlete wants to be. And I don't think there's any magic protein, certainly that's going to improve performance. So that's where the personalized approach comes in. Aiming for that target, and then whether you like to have a yogurt in the morning or a bagel and cream cheese, or you like your oats and eggs, it might not matter as much, with the exception that how does that sit in your stomach before you get on your bike.
Great. And regarding the optimization of training adaptations, you've recently published a paper on MSSE regarding the higher protein requirements endurance athletes in situations of training and reduced carbohydrate availability. And this is great, because this is the actual context of most endurance athletes, and particularly cycling, in which they organize their diets. And especially now that we have this proper framework model proposed by Dr. Sam Impey and Dr. James Morton of Fuel for the Work Required. And I'm really curious about this research from your lab. According to your data, how much could protein requirements be elevated while training with a low carbohydrate availability? How did you measure this? Can you get into more details on this, please?
Yeah, so we went back to our stable isotope method, the indicator amino acid oxidation, and we had athletes, trained runners, perform a simulated 2-day reduced carbohydrate availability training. So all the athletes came in the night before the metabolic trial and did a high-intensity glycogen depleting bout of exercise. So this was, I believe, an hour of intervals. In one condition, they ate a high amount of carbohydrate after the exercise, as well as the morning before the steady state run. And on low carbohydrate availability trial, they had less than a gram of carbohydrate in between training bouts. So coming back to what we said earlier, amino acids may contribute 2 to 5% to energy, but it might go up to 10% in low carbohydrate availability. And so what we saw was that the athletes, or the trial in which the athletes performed low carbohydrate availability, the requirements actually went up a modest amount, of about 0.15 grams per kilogram. And so this was after only a 10-kilometer run. So we believe that it would scale with the metabolic work. So if you were doing a 20-kilometer run, for example, or hour versus 2 hours on the bike, the requirement would go up, maybe not proportionally, but it could add another 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram to your daily requirement. So it doesn't seem like a lot, but that's essentially an extra meal at that optimal intake of about 0.25 grams per kilogram that these athletes, we believe, should be consuming during the recovery from that low carbohydrate availability run, so that their body is able to replenish what they used during the exercise and provide the building blocks to help them recover.
So could we perhaps say that with your research, we should then aim for that higher end of 1.2 or 2 grams per kilo while training with low carbohydrate availability?
Yes, definitely. If you're not at about 1.8, then you might want to at least get to that point.
Okay, perfect. And I remember reading some research indicating that there is actually a minimal amount of protein below which we could start seeing performance decrements or reduced training adaptations. Do we have enough evidence to sustain this, Daniel?
Yes, it's certainly, a cute 4-day trial that we talked about earlier in the podcast. In our hands, it seems to be somewhere between 1.8 and 1.2. And we don't know for certain, but the athletes who consume the 1.2 grams per kilogram, as I mentioned, muscle strength decreased, and their high intensity training capacity also decreased through the 5-kilometer time trial. So it's somewhere around, certainly I think if you're at that lower end of the requirement, the 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. In our hands, we don't think that that's sufficient to support training adaptations and recovery. And keep in mind, these are athletes who are only training once a day. So athletes that are doing multiple training bouts or have strength workouts as well, then that, in our mind, further strengthens the case that they need to be conscious of their protein intake and ensuring that they're at the higher end of that recommendation.
Awesome, Daniel. And considering now the role of protein in optimizing the recovery process in the endurance athlete, and taking into account a cyclist, for example, who needs to compete the next day, the recovery recommendations to optimize glycogen resynthesis establish that in this 4-hour post-competition period, the athlete must ingest 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo per hour of carbohydrate, or if not enough carbohydrate is available, the athlete should aim for 0.8 grams per kilo per hour of carbohydrate plus 0.4 grams per kilo per hour of protein. So my question here, Daniel, would be, should cyclists or endurance athletes focus on eating enough carbohydrate, or there is actually an advantage in including extra protein to an optimal amount of carbohydrate to increase recovery for the next day?
So, yeah, great question. And once again, I would ask, what is the athlete doing? Because these carbohydrate recommendations that are aimed to maximize glycogen resynthesis are really most important for individuals who might have less than 6 to 8 hours to recover in between bouts in which they would need to have maximal muscle glycogen resynthesis. So if an athlete is training once a day, they have more than 8 hours and definitely 24 hours to recover, then hitting those daily carbohydrate intakes are most important. So maybe 8 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. This nuanced requirement after exercise to maximize resynthesis only matters when you have a short recovery window. As far as enhancing that glycogen resynthesis rate, I know that there's some research that supports adding protein and others that don't. I think, though, from a more holistic perspective of recovery, I think to not include any protein in your post-exercise recovery is going to sacrifice your recovery goals. So while it may or may not enhance glycogen resynthesis, we know for certain it's going to enhance muscle protein remodeling, replenishment of body amino acid stores. So I still think it's great advice to include protein in your post-exercise recovery, keeping in mind that may or may not enhance glycogen resynthesis, but it's definitely going to enhance your recovery and, we believe, training adaptations. And also, it's important to, I think, to also contextualize the numbers you identify. So certainly for carbohydrate resynthesis, this 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour is important. But to add in, zero point 0.4 grams per kilogram per hour of protein, that's far in excess of what your body actually needs for recovery. So focusing in on the carbohydrate intakes and including even 0.1 grams per kilogram per hour of protein is going to give you a fair amount of protein over a 4-hour recovery period. So you might not need a lot of protein, but certainly having some is important, a holistic recovery perspective.
Sure, which is actually pretty easy to reach.
Yes.
Even only the recommendations of carbohydrate, we also get some protein in there.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really, really interesting because I insist on this point because what I see now from coaches and especially in teams that don't have nutritionists is that they only focus on protein. They think recovery is only providing protein. And we are here debating in sciences, does adding to carbohydrate, supplying enough carbohydrate, if adding some protein will help. But what I see, at least from my experience here in Europe, is that protein gets all the attention. That's why I like to insist on this point. And I know this may sound like a repetition, but we haven't been talking much about whey and casein. How can these supplements help cyclists particularly in reaching their dietary goals of protein or even recover? And in what particular moment would you say that such supplements would have a complementary role, since athletes normally think of supplementing first rather than correcting their diets first? What basic aspects on protein ingestion should they master before even considering supplementing?
As we said earlier, or as I said earlier, it should be a food first approach. And so look at your diet. Look at what kind of foods you're eating. Are they nutrient dense? Protein sources that come in nutrient dense packages, like eggs, for example, are going to be, in my mind, far superior than any isolated protein source that you would see in supplement form. Where I do think supplements might be a benefit is, you mentioned earlier that sometimes it's difficult to meet these high energy demands of athletes. And so supplements could be a convenient way of ensuring that adequate protein or more importantly, energy is consumed. If you go for a long ride and you have an hour or two before you can get to your next meal, then certainly having something that off the bike, convenient drink or bar form is a good way to go. But if you're able to design your training around your normal meal frequency patterns, then cycling and then having a shower and going right into your lunch, I think that should be viewed more favorably than looking at any kind of supplement.
Terrific point, Daniel. And considering that cyclists often compete until quite late in their lives, taking into account the increased anabolic resistance in older people and consequently in older riders, could we perhaps assume that protein requirements should be higher in these athletes? What data do we have on that?
Yeah, not a lot of data, to be certain. Some of the argument that the protein needs might be a little bit higher in masters athletes, I think, comes from the fact that as we age, we tend to lose muscle mass, and a higher protein diet in non-exercise older adults, for example, is able to help retain some of this muscle mass as we age. I think when we're very active, we like to view age not as a chronological construct. So how many years do you have? More biological. And so if someone is inactive, biologically they're much older than someone who's active at the same age. And so masters athletes sometimes have metabolism and muscle quality that is indistinguishable from similarly active athletes half their age. So there's a theoretical argument that perhaps protein needs are elevated in masters athletes, but I'm not convinced that that's the case because through their high activity levels, they're essentially keeping their bodies young. And so I think their metabolism is much more similar, not the same, of course, but similar to the younger counterparts as compared to someone who's old, inactive. Their definitely metabolism is far different than someone who's younger than them. So they might need to be aware of their dietary habits and ensuring that they meet the requirements that we see as being beneficial in younger athletes. I'm not convinced yet, based on the available data, that their needs are actually greater than younger athletes.
Great. Let's hope for that data to come up in the next year so we can make more sustained recommendations. And what advances on muscle protein research on endurance athletes would you like to see in the next 10 years?
That's a great question. I'm sure that Yeah, I'm sure there are greater minds than mine already working on some of these questions. I think we need to get a better handle on the individual responses that we see. And so when we present data in papers, we're looking at the average response, and that's great to inform us about general guidelines. But we talked earlier already about the individualized approach. What works for an individual is what matters most. It could be inspired by guidelines, but it found through tinkering with themselves. And so we do see that there are responders and non-responders in any training study. And so one athlete might benefit from a lower protein intake, and another might actually need a little bit more. So I don't know that what the study is per se, but in conducting more research, we're able to start pulling out some of these individual differences. And I would certainly hope that there's a desire for a collaborative research and pooling of data across labs to start understanding how individuals, what genetic signature or metabolic signature dictates someone who would have a higher protein need than someone else, looking at epigenetic changes, so modifications in our genes that can change the way those genes function. I mean, these are all questions that I think need to be answered to try and get at that idealized, futuristic, personalized approach where we could take a scan of someone's blood or look at their genetic signature and tell them exactly what diet they're going to excel on. Whether that's accomplished in the next 10 years or the next 50 years, I think that is where research will eventually go.
Let's hope we live enough to see it. And
stay active, and you got a good chance.
Let's keep on eating our requirements of protein so we can be forever young and still witness that effort to to understand more of this protein metabolism and the influence of genetics as well. And things are evolving really, really fast. Let's hope we can even contribute to that, and let's hope this podcast helps spread that message. So Daniel, if people want to keep up with your updates, where can people search for you or look for you?
Yeah, I've got a very small social media footprint, only because I'm not adept at that world. But the University of Toronto Faculty of Physiology and Physical Education website has updates on our research. My email is available there. I'd welcome individuals reach out to me by email. Maybe one day I'll get on Twitter and then I can share that with you. But email is great, and there's a lot of great researchers that have very active Twitter accounts that our research is shared through their accounts as well.
You can actually ask Stuart Phillips for some good advice on Twitter. He's really, really active on Twitter. I love it.
I will just send him all my papers and he can share them. He's got a far bigger network than I'm sure I ever will have.
Yeah, he can open a business of sharing articles and stuff on Twitter.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Daniel, thank you so much for your time. I've absolutely enjoyed this. It has been incredible. Let's hope our listeners have some really, really important information here on protein metabolism, on what protein should they consume, and even for the nutritionists that listen to this podcast, and to coaches and to some cyclists that have been reaching out. Let's hope this is useful for them as well. And for that, Daniel, I thank you for your time.
It was a pleasure, Gabriel, and thank you for inviting me here to speak about the research. And I'd like to applaud you for your evidence-based approach to your podcast and your information dissemination.
Thank you so much, and let's hope we can have that chat on 1 year's time to discuss the updates on your research on female athletes and all the things that we've said that we hope to be here on 50 years or 10 years, and let's hope they are here early than expected.
Be happy to.
And there you go. That was Daniel Moore from the University of Toronto. This was an amazing conversation to have, and I believe we all learned a lot from his precious insights from his vast research experience. I really hope you found this episode useful, especially if you're a sports nutritionist like me, working with cyclists, or if you're a cyclist yourself trying to improve your dietary habits. The weather is hot and sunny now, perfect for a bike ride, and that's exactly what I'm gonna do now in the mountains of the Sierra de Madrid and back to the lab and to my cyclists for another 2 weeks of research. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to have you here for episode 12. Bye bye.